Yes.
All right. Good. So if you hear me, then it's fine, and we will slowly start today's lecture. You're going to have a break next week due to the national holiday. So we will have a time to think about what we have covered so far. Good. So good morning once again, and welcome to this lecture. And today we're gonna talk about a particular subject which deserves its own name. So this will be the lecture, and let me share the screen. And let me all right. And the title for that lecture will be Cubism. And that is, as you can easily recognize, Winnie the Pooh, painted by Tomer Everick. And I thought that maybe we will start the lecture by having a look at the character from the book, which, I mean, I assume everybody simply loves. All right. We have been talking about the various consequences of the revolution in mathematics, which started in the mid of the 19th century when Bernard Riemann had shown us that there are other geometries possible than those which have been formulated within the scope of the Euclidean rules. And he also triggered the interest in the general population about the multidimensional spaces. And eventually we were also talking about the consequences, how this geometry of many dimensional spaces was used to formulate the principles of the special theory of relativity. I don't know whether the library in the Institute of Physics, that library which is on the top of the fourth floor, I mean, on top of the building, is open now, or it's locked down due to this pandemic regulation. But if it is open, and if someone of you is interested in how this idea of observing moving objects in the special theory of relativity has emerged, and when, I suggest you go to the library and pick up the, it requires a certain efforts, and search the issues of physics today from, I believe, 50s and 60s, and look up at the paper by Victor Weisskopf, on who had been, I believe, a first who brought to the attention of the science community that this simple application of the Lorentz transformation is not really a correct way of describing how we see the objects of the fast-moving, how we see the fast-moving objects within the realm of a special theory of relativity. That's very interesting paper. In the modern books on relativity theory, this chapter is occasionally also included, and there is a relatively old book on special theory of relativity written by Sullivan, and that book contains the Weisskopf analysis, including something which I haven't mentioned last time, and I will just say a few words about it right now. Namely, I mean, one of the tools of contemporary fundamental physics, of the elementary particle physics, high energy physics, are accelerators. And in accelerator, the charged particles are moving in a magnetic field, so they are moving at a very high velocity, and according to the laws of electrodynamics, then radiate electromagnetic radiation. And the experimental fact is that the radiation looks like it's being beamed forward of the moving on an orbit charged particle, while in the rest frame of that particle, the radiation is, of course, completely symmetric. And that phenomenon, that the radiation in our laboratory system looks like being beamed forward, and that is, of course, what is used in many applications of the radiation. For example, if you want to do spectroscopy of a kind using a synchrotron radiation, that is this fact that the radiation goes forward in our lab, while and that is just the same consequence as I have shown you, that the fast-moving object is seen as being rotated rather than squeezed or something, as described in the George Gamow book about the Mr. Tompkins. And we are at the turn of a century, and we will be talking about a certain revolutionary phenomenon which had happened at the time in art and literature, in poetry, and in some sense in understanding of the world, which get the name of cubism. And all that is related to that shabby-looking building. This is the original black and white photography of a building in Paris on Montmartre, which was a hub of the art and all sorts of intellectual revolutionary thinking in Paris at that time. And that particular little building, this one, was called Bateau Revoir, a wash house. Why that name? That is for the owners of that particular establishment. It looked like the wash houses, boats, which have been on the Seine River, where the mass washing of the clothes and everything was done commercially. And that building somehow resembles to somebody that these boats on the Seine, and that's the reason of the name. But that was actually a place for rent. It has a lots of little and not particularly comfortable apartments, but the main reason why the artist moved into it was that it was extremely cheap. The history says that the monthly rent of a room in that wash house was 15 francs per month. And at that time, a cheapest room in a hotel in Paris was a franc per day. So that was relatively cheap. That building survived many years. And this is a picture of the same building in the mid 70s, rather mid 60s, and you can see that there is a relative, almost a modern car park there, and that was the moment when this Bateau Lavoir was resurrected by some art dealers. They wanted to build it again as a cultural hub for their activities, and they started it, and very soon the building caught fire and was completely burned down, so it does not exist anymore. But that was a place where many of the most important artists of the 20th century have been either living or participating in the discussions which followed the meetings of the many artists in that particular place. And let me show you a picture of three individuals together. This is also the picture from a very early, just in any case, before the First World War. And from the left to right, this is the Amedeo Modigliani, Italian painter, Italian-born painter, I should say, who had been extremely influential in the various new trends in the paintings of the 20th century. He, to his right, is Pablo Picasso. We will be talking about the Pablo Picasso a lot. And the third individual is André Sullivan, who was an art critic and partially art dealer, who had been in this, participating in, among other people, in the meetings in the wash house at that time. There were many other individuals who had been extremely important in the history of intellectual life of the 20th century, who had been associated with the Bateau Lavoir. I mentioned few of those names. Henri Matisse, who was this painter, who was a kind of a bridge between the Impressionism and the modern 20th century painting. Guillaume Apollinaire, we will be talking a lot about him, a poet, one of the poets who was and is considered to be extremely influential in the transition of the poetry and the literary criticism from the 19th century way of creating poetry, for example, to what is more common in the 20th century. Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein was an American writer. Today we'll be probably calling her a feminist leader, and also a leader of the coming out minority, which we now call LGBT minority. And that was a lady who had coined the notion lost generation. The lost generation was a name Gertrude Stein affixed to the bunch of the mostly American intellectuals, young writers and poets who had found a second their second place to live in Paris at that time. And there were lots of them. And I just mentioned one of those names is a name of Ernest Hemingway, for we will be talking about the Hemingway in a moment. For Hemingway is by a certain, I mean, we shall see why I picked up out of those names the name of Ernest Hemingway. Well, there were many other, Scott Fitzgerald, we will also be talking about him, and many others. So they all were gathering inside of this shabby building on Montmartre, and there was some kind of a genius loci which developed there. Since I have mentioned Modigliani, this is let me make it smaller. This is a picture of Modigliani, and I picked up a painting by Modigliani, which is the portrait of Pablo Picasso from 1915 on the left, and the very interesting sculpture, female head from 1912, and it is this peculiar thin, the fact that the sculpture is kind of along the z-axis, we will say in physics, and that kind of a deformation in sculpture has been, I'm not sure I should use the word popular at the time between various sculptures, but if you will be ever in Zurich, and if you will go to the National Museum, which in Zurich Museum, National Zurich Museum, which is next to the ETH on the Remystrasse. We were talking about the ETH in last time, and well, this museum is worth while to be seen, not only due to the fact that it has some sculpture of Rodin, including that famous sculpture of the thinker, this sitting thinker, but it also has a special division of Giaconetti, who was an Italian, Swiss, French sculptor, and all his sculptures are these very deformed individuals, extremely thin, and almost, I would say, attempting to be the one dimension. And that is also seen here in the sculpture of Modigliani. A few weeks ago, or am I not? I mean, anyway, about a month ago or so, there was an auction in Warsaw of the paintings of one of the most important Polish sculpture ladies. And if you look at the paintings of her on those sculptures, you have a feeling that they are somewhat also similar in spirit to those elongated sculpture, like the female head of the Modigliani. The most important individual who had actually converted that commune, I would say, from the wash house into an active intellectual hub was Guillaume Apollinaire. Guillaume Apollinaire was an interesting individual. He was actually a Polish, Belarusian, Italian, French poet. His original name was Wilhelm Albert Włodzimierz Apolinary de Wąż-Kostrowicki. He was born in Rome, and very soon his family moved to France, to Paris. And he was not only a poet, but he was also a thinker, a philosopher. At that time, it was fairly popular that the poets and writers and also painters occasionally were the very deep philosophers. We had this example in Poland slightly later. You might have heard about the Polish painter and author Picasso. And Picasso was also a deep philosopher. And among his texts he left, there are very interesting thinking about, for example, relativity theory. Guillaume Apollinaire was an individual who actually not invented, but made the word cubism very popular. And that is a front page of an article written by Apollinaire in a journal, which was a literary journal he was an editor of. And that is where the word cubism appeared for the same time. But during his life, his poetry was also extremely well known all over Europe. And that is a monument in one of the most famous university towns in Europe, in Leiden, in Netherlands, which is a poetry of Apollinaire. You can read it, but I mean, it's in any way in French. And Apollinaire had dominated the discussions in Bateau Lavoir. And he also was bringing to that place those members of the lost generation I mentioned, and also the other individuals. His life was very short, as you see. When the first war was started, he was, well, at that time, for a people of a certain financial and intellectual status, it wasn't clear they were drafted or they have volunteered to join the army. But in any way, he went to the battlefront and was very badly injured and was dismissed from the army. He returned to Paris and he died in 1918 in the year of the armistice. One of those lost generation members who had been a friend of Apollinaire and frequent guest in the Bateau Lavoir were Ernest Hemingway, a Nobel Prize winner, and one of these giants of a 20th century literature, and one of the pillars on which this domination of American literature in the 20th century was built. Ernest Hemingway was living in Paris in and out for a considerable part of his life. In some sense, he was there living for a period of time with each of his 4 wives. And but the most important period of his time was that which was just before and after a First World War. And this is the title page of one of these most important books of our literature, A Farewell to Arms, which had been published in 1929, and that is a story, actually almost an autobiographical story of a young American boy who volunteered even before the American armies joined the war in Europe. We are talking about the First War, and volunteer to serve as the driver of an ambulance for Italian army on Italian front. And he is being badly injured and so forth and so forth and so forth. This is a remarkable book. And it is somewhat astonished that the intellectuals of Europe and basically the world who had read that book in the 30s had not understood that the war is such an incredible destructive event for human development. And a few years after that book, the world made the first step towards another war. And that was that were the Japanese invasions in China, but also in Europe. The civil war started in Spain, but soon we had the Second World War. And the other important book of Ernest Hemingway is this other fundamental book of the literature. The title is For Whom the Bell Tolls. In 1936, the Spain there was this disaster happening in Spain. The unfortunately fairly popular general with the name Franco organized mutiny against the democratic and, well, we have to admit it, pretty confused in activities, liberal and democratic government of the Spain. And the civil war which started was, of course, had the two sides, the rebellion army of Franco and the government army. And the Franco was helped by the two totalitarian countries already existing at the time in Europe, namely Italy, fascist Italy, under the guidance of the Caudillo Mussolini, and the Nazi country, the Germany, under the Führer Adolf Hitler. And the government side, this democratic part, was supported by, well, mostly by the communist and leftist motions and political groups in Europe, and that was organized and sponsored by the Soviet Russia, but also by the liberals from all over the world who went to Spain to fight on the side of the democratic government. And Hemingway was there as a war reporter, and the story For Whom the Bell Tolls is a story about the American Robert Jordan, who is an expert in explosive, and he is fighting with a group of the pro-government partisans in Spain. And he actually dies there. And why am I mentioning this? For this, this is a view of that dramatic event, which was the war. And one of the elements of the war was that the Italian and German organized Air Force, an escadra with the name Condor had bombarded a civilian village, Guernica, in 1937. And that was that dramatic step at which somehow our civilization had accepted that the attack on the civilian town, which has no absolutely military value, but it causes a dramatic shake-up of a population, like a terrorist attack, are allowed tools of the war. And the bombing of Guernica, that was the name of that town, had been extremely important, and it joined in the art creation of these two individuals, Ernest Hemingway and Pablo Picasso. We will be talking about that in a moment, but I wanted you just to give you a flavor of how widely spread was the interest of the people who gather in the Bateau Lavoir and sit there over a bottle of absinthe and discuss many things. And this, one of them was also the Fred Scott Fitzgerald, that's his picture, who, among other things, had written again one of these incredible books of our literature, The Great Gatsby. And that's the book which you might have seen converted into the movie. And I believe that this is a dream of many male film actors to star Gatsby in consecutive remakes of that movie. So this is a poster from a Great Gatsby movie from the late 40s, and that is a pretty recent one with DiCaprio. You can recognize him. So that was another individual who was a member of that group of people gathering in the wash house. And one of the individuals there was a certain gentleman, Maurice Princet. Maurice Princet was a mathematician. He was apparently one of the early mathematicians who was using mathematics, particularly probability theory, into description of even creating something which is called the mathematics of insurance. He was a mathematician of insurance. He was extremely well-to-do, and he was actually also very familiar with all the main new results in various branches of mathematics on his time. He was also a follower of Henri Poincaré, have read his book, Science and Method, and he had been very interested in conveying the information about the progress in mathematics to the other individuals who were his friend. If in the 60s, a certain gentleman, Mark Decimo, had written a book, Maurice Princet, and as you can read it, it's written, A Mathematician of Cubism. That was true. Princet had a partner, and that lady has been working as a model for painters associated with Bateau Lavoir. So Maurice Princet was joining the evening's discussion there. He was very friendly with Apollinaire, and one of his best friends from that commune was Pablo Picasso. And during the joint parties, Princet was telling those painters about the book we already mentioned, a book by this French engineer Giffred, who had written a book about the four-dimensional space geometry and how the four-dimensional objects can be visualized by drawing the projections on a two-dimensional space. And I again remind you some drawings from Giffred's book, which appeared in 1903. So Princet had shown those pictures to those drawings and explained how they were built and so forth to the painters in the Bateau Lavoir. And this is a fragment of from the paper written by one of the members of that commune, Maurice Vlaming, who years later, in the 42, in the some article had written, "I witnesses the birth of Cubism, its growth and its decline. Picasso was the obstetrician, Guillaume Apollinaire the midwife, and Princet the godfather." So the Princet had influenced the artist by showing them this other geometry, the other way of looking at the world. And we are coming to Pablo Picasso, who was the giant of the art of the 20th century. All the artism of the 20th century was in some sense dominated by the artistic activities of Pablo Picasso. And that is, and in the 1907, Picasso had painted a painting which is considered to be the beginning of a cubism. This is one of these world masterpieces, and it's called the Ladies of Avignon, the Demoiselles d'Avignon. And it resides in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And this is a painting on which there are two, which shows these two influences of mathematics on the art of the dominating for a while group of or way of thinking about the art which originated in Bateau Lavoir. One is the story is that if you look at this so-called kneeling mademoiselle, then some of those elements are, according to the experts, actually as only slightly deformed copies of the pieces of drawings of Jouffret. And the other elements here is that this painting attempts to show the simultaneity of the events in time on the same part of the picture. That is what we have seen in the Duchamp painting of these ladies walking down the stairs, and for completely different reason, and in not related to in any way to cubism or anything, as stained glass in the Franciscan church in Krakow made by Stanisław Wyspiański, or in the book by Joyce, In the Figueroa's Wake, where the book is happening essentially simultaneously, or the events are at the same moment of time. So the Cubism had attempted to join the new geometry of a four-dimensional space as projected on our world of Jouffret, Hinton, and the others, and also this attempt to show us simultaneous events in time jointly. This is another cubist painting from the same time by Picasso. This is his autoportrait. And here is the famous Chicago monument of Picasso from 1950. It has a complicated story, how it ended up at the Delhi Plaza in Chicago. But that is a picture, that is a giant sculpture. And here comes the description. What do you see on it? A baboon, a horse, a dog, or a gift. And actually, if you will be there and you want to even get a glimpse and develop your own idea, what is that sculpture all about, you have to walk around it. And you have, by activity of your own imagination, somehow connect different pieces of the view of that sculpture from different direction to see your own object. It might be, as it says here, a baboon, a horse, or dog. And it is really something very, very incredible. So this is another example of how this new geometry had influences the Cubism. And this is this most dramatic painting of Pablo Picasso, Guernica. It is not a black and white picture. It is a black and white, essentially black and white painting. And it was painted by Picasso right after the Condor division had bombed Guernica in 1937. That was his protest against the war. And right after it was painted, this painting was traveling all over Europe and shown in various museums. And the money which were collected from the sale of tickets for that exhibition were donated for a help to the victims of that bloody civil war, particularly those defeated government supporters who had to leave Spain and have been living in the camps on the foots of Pyrenees mountains and in a disaster situation. That was one of the most cruel civil war in Europe. And if you will be ever spending vacations on the Canary Islands and took a excursion all over the island, Tenerife Island, and go up to how high it is allowed to the Teide Volcano. There are nice roads, and those roads were made by the prisoners of war. I mean, those defeated soldiers and supporters of the government who were defeated by Franco and were basically put in the concentration camp and used as a slave labor to build many things in the Spain. Guernica was a painting. This painting was in New York. And after the Franco government died, and after his death, the followers of that totalitarian system, as it is most often in history, were not capable of sustaining the totalitarian system anymore. And Spain became a democratic country, which for a complicated reason became a kingdom. And it attempted to get back Guernica, and Guernica is now in Madrid in the Museo of Reina Sofia in Madrid, which you can see it without necessarily crossing the Atlantic. But there are also relations of Pablo Picasso to Poland. In 1948, a Polish government had launched in Wrocław, formerly Breslau, a town which had been on the Polish side of the border after the Second War, organized a kind of a culture congress, intellectuals against the war, or if you want, intellectuals for peace. And the Polish government worked very hard to get Pablo Picasso to be a participant in that Congress. They even sent him a private plane. Sure, there were no private planes at the time in Poland. So that was just repainted military plane which went there. And it turns out that it was the first time in his life that Picasso took a flight. And he enjoyed apparently immensely that trip by plane. And when he arrived to Wrocław, the organizer asked him to draw something which will be a symbol of that fight for peace. And Picasso took a piece of charcoal which he carried in his pocket and drew that picture. This is a famous dove of peace. Well, it has a biblical connotations. I mean, it's the dove who come back to the Noah after the deluge, but that is the Picasso painting, and it became a symbol of the peace movement all over the world. That was this Wrocław dove with the palm branch in his beak. It's not only the picture of Picasso, which has some relation to Poland. Picasso was, there were at the time, there were several Polish artists who knew Picasso from the time of Paris, and they invited Picasso to Warsaw. And at the time, the New Living part in Warsaw, it's called Koło, was rebuilt after the war. And Picasso was taken there on the tour and was shown one of the relatively very small apartments which have been built there for the workers. And he got out that piece of charcoal again, and he drove on the wall of that apartment a picture of a Warsaw mermaid, a symbol of Warsaw. And that becomes a disaster for people who own that apartment, because for many years they have been living in some kind of a one-room museum. They were not allowed to do anything with that wall, and they were subject to many people coming and insisting on seeing the Picasso mermaid. And there were school excursions, and the workers from the mine visiting Warsaw, and so forth and so forth. And eventually in 1953, I believe, those people get mad and they painted over that mermaid, and this piece of art had disappeared. At that time, I don't know why the wall. I mean, there are techniques which allow to take the mural out of the wall and move it somewhere else. Why that hasn't been done. The Cubism was not only in the paintings of Picasso and Metzinger and others, but it was also formulated as a theory. And this is a sentence from a little book about the Cubism written by Albert Gleizes and Jean Metzinger. If we wish to relate the space of the Cubist painters to the geometry, we should have to refer it to the non-Euclidean mathematics. We should have to study at some length certain of the Riemann theorems. So as you see, this is basically what we will be talking until now. And that is a painting by Jean Metzinger called Still Nature or Natur Morte from 11. And this is another important theoretical documents of Cubism. It is a so-called Dimensionist Manifesto. There was a group of artists called themselves Dimensionists, and that is from the 1933. And let me read it for you. We must accept the fact that space and time are not separate categories, absolutely in opposition to one another, as was earlier believed and taken for granted, but rather that they are related dimensions in the sense of non-Euclidean concept. By intuiting this fact or by making it our own through conscious means, all of the borders of the barriers of the art suddenly disappear. So as you see, those artists had truly been influenced by non-Euclidean geometry invented by Riemann and by the concept of the space and time, which was born with the special theory of relativity. And that is description of what the dimensionists were using. But what I'm interested in by showing you the list of the artists who signed the Dimensionist Manifesto, and many of them, but I have underlined names we either already encountered, like Marcel Duchamp, or the names which we'll be talking about after this break of next week, like Kandinsky. And I'm also interested in what is written here. The following foreign endorsement appeared in it. And this is the Alexander Calder. This is the father of a mobile sculpture. And Juan Miró, I mean, if you will ever go to Barcelona, not only the Gaudi is architectural creations, which are things to be seen in Barcelona, but you have to go to the museum for the lots of the paintings and drawings by Miró. And this is something which says Kobro, Warsaw. Well, that was actually Katarzyna Kobro, a Polish artist born in, I believe it's now in Estonia. And she was at that time still in the Russia, Tsar Russia. And there are hardly any sculptures or paintings by her which survive the cataclysm of a second war. That is the reconstruction of one of her sculpture. Katarzyna Kobro she married another artist, painter, Władysław Strzemiński, who had been participating in the war on Apollinaire was on the Western Front, and Strzemiński was on the Eastern Front, and he was badly wounded in the act of war. He lost his leg and hand, and nevertheless, he had not stopped to produce masterpieces. Both of them, Strzemiński and Kobro, for a while lived in Vitebsk. A town of Vitebsk was a capital of an art explosion which happened in the Russia right after the revolution. That was a town of Marc Chagall, and that was where many other Russian important painters were living. We will be talking somewhat about them, particularly about the Kazimierz Malevich in what follows. But the Kobro and Strzemiński were there. This is Władysław Strzemiński. And the Strzemiński had invented his own theory. Many artists like to have not only make pictures, but also make a theory about it. And that was a theory of aftersight, the powidoki. And this is a picture of Władysław Strzemiński from after the war. The title powidoki, we discussed that phenomenon, and I have shown you the use of that phenomenon by Vincent van Gogh in one of his paintings. And a few years later, I mean, wasn't it 7 years ago or 8 years ago, Andrzej Wajda, one of the most important movie directors living in Poland, had made a movie about Władysław Strzemiński, which is called The Powidoki. And that is a movie in which the Katarzyna Kobro hardly appears. She dies at the beginning of the movie, but somehow the whole movie is full of a spiritual presence of Katarzyna Kobro. Strzemiński after the war, had returned to his home, to the town where they were living before the war, the town of Łódź, and this is on the west of Warsaw, a 1 hour drive. And he opened up the School of Art there. And when the communists have taken a complete power in post-war Poland, they not only closed that school, but they also persecuted Strzemiński. And that is, he died in extreme poverty and in the 50s. And if you will ever have a chance of seeing that movie, I believe it is in one of the streaming services, is available on one of the streaming services. So why don't you see it? I mean, maybe it's not a particularly good about talking about the art, and but the story about what has happened to the independently minded individuals under the totalitarian government is shown there extremely well. I would like to finish the story about the Cubism, which will also be the end of today's lecture. For this is a kind of one block which had a well-defined beginning with the Battle of War, and I'd like to close it with this, and we will start a new subject after we meet again after that next week break. This is a story which is related to what Albert Einstein was thinking about those trends in art, which claimed that they have been related to the relativity theory and the mathematics. And in the story is hardly known, so I would like to mention it for you. In 1946, a painter, Paul Laporte, who was teaching art in one of these colleges in Michigan, Oliver College, he wrote a letter to Albert Einstein asking him about opinion about the relativity theory and art. As far as I know, the content of that Laporte original letter to Einstein is not available. But Einstein replied to the letter on May 4th, and that handwritten letter of Einstein survived. And but it took a long time to find it, and eventually it was published by Mr. Laporte in another paper he written, Cubism and Relativity, which was published 20 years later in the journal Art Journal. And I unfortunately have only a part of I copied years ago in the United States, and I just have a small part of that copy of that second paper by Laporte, which is the original answer of Einstein. And I don't have it in full. I'm sorry. I even don't know. I mean, it is included in the Einstein documents which are stored at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. But I asked the curator of that collection of Einstein papers, who is a very good friend and distinguished physicist, and he was not able to locate anything more than I have here. So let me show you this, and this is a very bad copy, so I will read it. But that is interesting because this is a true words of Einstein. That's what he taught about the relation of art and mathematics. And as you shall see, that is in all the beauty of and clarity of Einstein, what we are attempting to understand through all those lectures. So it is signed on the 4th of May of 46. And the first sentence refers to the original ideas of Laporte about the relation of relativity and cubism, and his understanding of what the relativity theory all about was truly wrong. So the first sentence of Einstein is, I find your comparison rather unsatisfactory. And then he follows, if I disregard the practical value of a science, I do see a similarity between the scientific and the artistic activity. Both attempt to assemble from parts of a whole, which by itself is indistinct. And here is the original German words used. He answered in German, in such a way that the resulting order creates the distinctions and clarity. The distinctness and clarity thus achieved give us a satisfaction of a higher order. This occurs both in science and in art. In science, the principle of order, which creates units, is achieved through logical connection, while in art, the principle of order is anchored in unconscious. The artistic principle of order is always based on a traditional models of connection, which are felt as equally compelling by those who live in this tradition as a logical connection is felt by a scientifically oriented person. The essence of a traditional models of connection in art show itself clearly in the simple forms of art. Example, in a music melody and the ornament, which are based on intuitively grasped regularity. In both cases, the means of achieving clarity are felt to be necessary, just as in mathematics, logical conclusion is felt to be necessary. In more complex form of art, the means of granting clarity or unity, now the unity is in the quotation mark, are less easily recognized. So I thought that this might be interesting for you to read or listen to what Einstein was saying about that story, which I was showing you over trying also to put it in a proper perspective of what was the intellectual life at that time in dominating culturally place in Europe, which was Paris, just before and right after the Second War. All right, I believe that this will be inappropriate now to start after this Einstein quotation, and I think since this is recorded and it's on the file, you might try to get it and read by yourself. it's worthwhile to think about these words of Einstein, actually, as always. And so we will just break at that point today. And as I said at the beginning, next week is November 11, and November 11 is the national holiday in Poland. It's a day traditionally to be associated with regaining of independence of Poland after the First World War. Actually, a day when Marshal Pilsudski had returned from his imprisonment in Magdeburg to Warsaw. And I hope it will be a peaceful day, although since several years, this is the day when instead of celebrating the independence, there are riots on the streets. Let's hope that this year it will be at least more peaceful than it was last year when actually a sculpture apartment which happened to be on the way on the street on which the huge illegal demonstration of a nationalist movement was happening was burned. So that is also the relation to the art. And we see each other in 2 weeks. And thanks you for being with me. And what happened? This is, I stopped sharing the screen. So again, thanks for being with me, and see us in 2 weeks. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.